Somewhere in Southeast Asia, a $15 billion airport is being built on ground that engineers privately admit will never stop falling. And the most terrifying part is that everyone involved already knew this before they poured a single bag of cement. Because what's happening right now in the waters off Manila isn't a construction project anymore. It's a slow-motion bet against the ocean itself. And the people who placed that bet are starting to realize they may have already lost. Picture an international airport so overwhelmed that it has earned a brutal nickname among the people forced to use it: the black hole of schedules. Runways that cross each other like a dangerous game of chicken. Passengers trapped for hours inside stale, overheating cabins, waiting for a single gap on the tarmac. Manila's main airport was never built for the city it now serves, and there's nowhere left to put a bigger one. E-mountains are too risky, too expensive, too slow. The slums can't simply be erased. So one of the most powerful corporations in the Philippines looked at a map, looked at the open water of Manila Bay, and made a decision that should have terrified everyone who heard it. If there's no room on land, we will build our own land. We will take territory from the sea itself. But Manila Bay is not some calm, forgiving stretch of water. The Philippines sits directly inside the Pacific Ring of Fire, a region where tectonic plates grind against each other with such violence that they produce some of the most destructive earthquakes and tsunamis on the planet. Building here, in this bay, on this fault-riddled coastline, is not engineering caution, it's provocation. It is the equivalent of constructing a glass palace on the back of a sleeping dragon and hoping it never rolls over. And this dragon has woken up before. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted with such force that it hurled millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere and cooled the entire planet's average temperature for months. That eruption happened less than 100 kilometers from where this airport now stands. Seismologists studying the bay don't mince words. They call it a powder keg. Beneath those runways lies sand so saturated with water that, in the right earthquake, it can lose its ability to hold weight in an instant. Solid ground can turn to liquid in seconds, a phenomenon capable of swallowing a multi-ton terminal building the way quicksand swallows anything that steps into it. The scientists raised every alarm they had. The corporation listened, calculated the cost of walking away, and decided the risk was worth $15 billion. To put that number in perspective, that's enough money to buy 350 brand new Boeing 737s and outfit every regional airport in the area with them twice over. Instead, they chose 4 enormous runways on a stretch of coastline in Bulacan that had already been sinking on its own for years, ground made of soft, liquid mud that no one had ever tried to build an international airport on before. Independent geologists called the plan reckless. The builders called in the Dutch. Dredging ships sailed in from the Netherlands, a nation that has spent centuries perfecting the art of stealing land from the sea, and they began the largest engineering battle Asia has ever attempted. In a stretch of bay as deep as a 3-story building, they needed to manufacture dry, solid land covering the equivalent of 2,500 football pitches, and they worked around the clock to do it, dropping enormous pipes to the seafloor, sucking up millions of tons of marine sand, and pumping it under pressure onto the site of the future runways. Then they hit a wall no machine could push through. The seafloor wasn't sand, it was soft, liquid clay, and every time heavy sand was dumped onto it, the two materials behaved like cream poured into coffee, refusing to mix, refusing to settle. The sand sank straight through the mud instead of resting on top of it, and the displaced liquid mud rose to the surface, turning the entire construction zone into a churning swamp. Landing a plane on ground like that wouldn't just be risky, it would be a guaranteed catastrophe. Engineers from the Dutch firm Boskalis ran the numbers and felt their stomachs drop. If the trapped water inside that mud layer wasn't drawn out before construction continued, the simple vibration of a Boeing touching down would turn the entire runway into liquid soup beneath the wheels. There's a name for this in geology: soil liquefaction. Picture one of the most expensive dredging vessels in the world, the Willem van Oranje, worth hundreds of millions of euros, blasting a column of sand into the water. And instead of building upward, watching that sand simply vanish downward, into the mud like it had been poured into a bottomless bowl of soup. When the engineers finally measured exactly how deep this liquid layer ran, the number stopped them cold. In some places, the soft mud went down 20 to 30 meters. That isn't seabed, that's gelatin. Every standard European land reclamation technique, refined over centuries, in the cold, controlled waters of the Netherlands, simply failed here in the heat and chaos of tropical Asia. They needed something radical, and what they came up with sounds almost too simple to work. Millions of vertical plastic drains hammered into the seafloor down to a depth equal to a 10-story building, turning the entire site into something like a giant drying rack. When the heavy ballast sand was poured on top, It acted like a massive piston, forcing the trapped water down through those plastic capillaries and back out into the sea, leaving behind ground finally solid enough to build on. But the ocean wasn't finished fighting back. Nearly every month, violent storms tore across the bay, and within hours, waves would chew away the freshly built sand mounds and drag months of labor straight, back into the deep. The builders had to start over again and again. Eventually, they brought in massive granite boulders and wrapped the edges of the artificial island in stone walls, an endless convoy of barges hauling rock into Bulacan Bay around the clock, until the sand island finally rose permanently above the waterline and heavy machinery could roll in to compact the new ground. For a moment, it looked like the hardest part was over. The new foundation for what would become a global aviation hub had been won from the sea, and people celebrated. They celebrated too soon. Before a single cubic meter of terminal concrete had been poured, the island ran straight into a new disaster, one that forced engineers to rip up every blueprint they had. When they originally designed the flood walls, they studied 50 years of weather data from the bay and calculated that walls roughly 2 stories tall would protect the site from anything the ocean could throw at it. But 50 years of historical weather data means nothing in a warming ocean. Super typhoon frequency in the region has tripled. Storm surges driven by winds approaching 300 kilometers an hour now shove billions of tons of seawater straight into the narrow funnel of the bay. And one of those surges simply walked over the top of the 2-story walls and flooded the entire construction site. The engineers had designed an airport for the climate of the last century while being forced to build it inside a new era of climate chaos. When satellite data was finally run through the supercomputers, a red zone lit up on the screen. In the next major storm, the nearly finished runways would sit underwater up to 2 meters deep. That's not a delay. That's a disaster waiting for a date on the calendar. Construction froze in the middle of the bay. With millions of tons of sand already in place, the entire plan had to be rewritten in real time. The corporation's leadership scrapped the old blueprints and gave one blunt order: raise the island higher. For months, barges and trucks worked non-stop, hauling in additional fill, costs spiraling, deadlines collapsing. They thickened the sand layer and reinforced the shoreline with massive concrete tetrapods. Those 4-pronged interlocking blocks you've almost certainly seen guarding breakwaters around the world, some weighing up to 25 tons each. Tens of thousands of them were needed just for Bulacan. Concrete factories across the country ran at full capacity, and barges queued at special docks 24 hours a day in scenes that looked less like a construction project and more like a wartime troop landing. They wrapped the airport in a literal suit of concrete armor, betting that the ocean simply wouldn't be able to break through it. And for a while, it looked like a fortress, ready to absorb anything the sea could send at it from above. But the engineers had been so focused on the threat coming from the water that they completely missed the danger rising silently from beneath their own feet. While crews celebrated their victory over the storms, sensors buried across the construction site were quietly recording something far more disturbing. The $15 billion fortress had begun sinking, slowly, continuously, and without ever announcing itself. Satellite monitoring systems and ground sensors confirmed the unthinkable. The new artificial island was settling several centimeters every single year, and the cause wasn't simply the weight of the sand pressing down on soft seabed. The real problem ran far deeper, into the coastline of Bulacan and neighboring Manila itself, where millions of people live, work, and unknowingly accelerate their own city's disappearance. For decades, residents, textile factories, and fish farms across the region have pumped fresh groundwater out of the earth around the clock, because there is simply no other reliable source of drinking water nearby. Every liter pulled from underground leaves behind an empty cavity that used to be filled with water, and the soil above it compresses and drops, exactly like a dry sponge crushed in a closed fist. This new airport has an older, more terrifying sibling. Kansai International Airport, built on an artificial island in Osaka Bay, Japan, by engineers who were considered the absolute masters of this kind of construction, and who also believed they had accounted for everything. The sea taught them otherwise. In its first 30 years, Kansai sank over 11 meters, fast enough that waves began creeping into the ground floor of the passenger terminal. To save a $20 billion investment, Japanese engineers installed more than 1,000 giant hydraulic jacks beneath the terminal's foundations. Every supporting column now rests on one of those jacks, and a network of sensors monitors the building's tilt around the clock while the computer system raises or lowers different sections millimeter by millimeter, just to keep the structure from tearing itself apart under uneven subsidence. It is permanent, brutally expensive surgery on a building that will never stop needing it. And Kansai's story has had genuinely terrifying chapters. When Typhoon Jebi tore through Japan in 2018, it shattered the airport's protective seawalls. Seawater flooded the runways, swallowed underground shelters, and submerged large sections of the terminal. Thousands of passengers were trapped inside a powerless building in the middle of the sea, no air conditioning, no communication, while a tanker ship torn loose from its moorings slammed into the only bridge connecting the airport to the mainland. Japan spent billions repairing the damage. This is the exact scenario hanging over Bulacan, except the situation there is dramatically worse, because in Japan, the island sinks under its own weight, while in Bulacan, the entire region is being hollowed out from below by human extraction of groundwater on a scale that outpaces even the worst predictions. European Space Agency satellites have confirmed that this stretch of Philippine coastline is subsiding faster than almost anywhere else in Southeast Asia, in some areas by as much as 5 centimeters every year. Villages nearby now flood routinely, even during ordinary low tides. This $15 billion airport is being built directly inside the epicenter of that collapse. Even if engineers perfectly stabilize the artificial island itself, the surrounding land will keep sinking, and the highways, rail lines, and long bridges currently being built to connect Manila to this new terminal will start sinking right along with the coastline that supports them. Within years, passengers could find themselves unable to physically reach their own flights by road. Engineers scrambled, drilling deep reinforcement wells along the shoreline and pumping in specialized concrete mixtures to brace the coast, but none of it touches the real cause: the relentless extraction of groundwater across the wider region, a threat completely invisible from the surface and completely outside the airport's control. And while crews fought to keep the access roads from drowning, a second, far more human battle erupted around them. Local communities, whose homes and livelihoods stood directly in the path of heavy machinery, began to fight back. For thousands of fishing families, this bay wasn't just a construction site, it was the only life they had ever known, sustained for generations by dense mangrove forests, trees uniquely capable of thriving in salt water, their tangled roots forming a natural nursery for fish and shrimp while shielding the coast from erosion. When the bulldozers tore out centuries-old mangroves and buried them under sand, the entire ecosystem collapsed within weeks. The fish vanished. Thousands of people lost their livelihoods overnight. Protests erupted across the region because this bay once supplied fresh seafood to all of Greater Manila, and once the mangroves were gone, seafood prices in the capital spiked, turning what used to be an everyday meal into a luxury the poorest families could no longer afford. Local leaders said it plainly in interviews: these corporations are building a gateway for wealthy tourists, while taking the rice off our tables. In the Philippines, the voice of major capital often carries more weight than the voices of thousands of fishermen, and this conflict escalated all the way to the national level, with increased security around the construction site and law enforcement drawn directly into the dispute. Communities tried blocking the dredging fleet with their own fishing boats, forming human chains on the water to halt the Dutch ships. Activists took the fight to the Philippine Supreme Court, demanding an end to the destruction of an ecosystem that took centuries to form. Tensions peaked when the loss of those mangroves caused nearby coastal villages to start flooding even during completely normal high tides, nature retaliating almost instantly once its natural armor had been stripped away. By now, investors have poured so much money into this artificial ground that walking away would mean admitting total financial collapse. Today, the land reclamation itself is finished. Where open water once rolled, a colossal gray island now rises, larger than entire natural archipelagos. Thousands of tons of steel reinforcement bars have already arrived, and crews are pouring the foundations for the first terminal buildings to the constant roar of heavy machinery. Massive aircraft will soon begin landing here one after another, but the engineers who built this place have quietly admitted something they can no longer hide. This artificial island will never stop sinking. Humanity hasn't defeated the ocean here, it has simply rented a little extra time from it for the price of $15 billion. From this point forward, the life of this airport becomes an endless, exhausting fight for survival. While passengers calmly sip coffee in the terminal above, dozens of powerful pumping stations beneath their feet will run 24 hours a day, every single day, pulling millions of liters of groundwater and rainwater back out into the bay, just to keep the ground usable. Every few years, engineers will be forced to shut down one runway after another to lay fresh layers of asphalt over ground that never stops settling beneath it. A single hairline crack in the protective seawalls could let saltwater flood multi-million-dollar navigation equipment and ground every flight at once. Keeping this fortress standing will require colossal, never-ending sums of money, and those costs will inevitably be folded into the price of every ticket sold here. In the end, it won't be the corporation or the government absorbing the true cost of this battle against nature. It will be the ordinary passenger, quietly paying for it one boarding pass at a time. What's rising in Bulacan will stand as a singular monument to human stubbornness, a stark example of just how much risk and expense a modern state is willing to accept to keep its economy afloat. But was it worth it? Is this airport the lifeline Asia desperately needed, or a $15 billion trap that the ocean will eventually, inevitably, reclaim? Let me know what you think in the comments below.